Emma. I've known Emma for years and years because she used to be the best quality assurance officer for us as a City Guild Centre. She's really experienced in advocacy, having been a mental health advocate in the UK, a trainer, and she did loads of work with us as a training centre. And then sadly, a few years ago, for us, but amazingly for her, she went to Australia and is now running a really big mental health advocacy service. And that's what she's going to talk to us about today. So Emma, welcome.
Thank you so much. As you said, it is 10 o'clock at night, so I've had a long day, but I'm sure we will get there.
Yeah, definitely. So you've got screen sharing facilities now.
Yep.
So I'm going to just share your screen. I'll turn my video off and leave you to it, and then I'll be back with some questions later.
Okay, no problem. How am I not doing this?
Just as Emma's doing that, I will issue a warning that her accent has changed dramatically. And
I don't think it has. I do think. Can you see the whole? Am I doing the slide from the beginning? Can you see? Can you just
see
slide?
your kind of screen, it's not in presentation mode, but I think that's okay. That's okay.
I can't get it into. I'm so sorry. I'll do this. Don't worry. Here we go. Off we go. We've got it now. So yes, a few things that I'm going to explain from the beginning, because I have spent the last 3 years learning not to say IMHA, because in Australia we are called IMHA. So I'm going to apologize from the beginning. I'm going to spend the next hour getting myself back into the IMHA mode. So if I slip out of that, I do apologize. And off I go. Here we are. So in Australia, we actually have 6 states and 2 territories, and each one of those has a different mental health act, and there are different legislations across each one. Victoria is the second smallest state in Australia and is only one of 2 places to have an IMHA service. The other is Western Australia. However, their model is very different to the one in Victoria. The one in Victoria aligns itself very similar to the UK and what I was practicing there. So that's kind of my first starting point. Now, Victoria as a state is actually, we have a population of 7 million people. So not a huge population. And the size of the state is 91,000 square miles, which is pretty much the same size as England, Wales, and Scotland all put together. And we have one IMHA service that covers the whole of the state. And I guess one of the differences I really noticed when I moved over here and started working with the service was that in the UK, we have lots of smaller services and it can be quite fragmented in a way, but you do have each other to bounce off. So you've got other services that you can link up with, you can interact with, and you can kind of talk things through. Whereas here, we are just one service that covers the whole of the state. We don't have any of those interactions. We do have teams, 4 different teams in Victoria, but we're still run by the same provider. So I found that a really good reflective point, that although there were smaller services in the UK, actually there were other services to bounce off. So I found that really important. So here in Victoria, how things are working for IMHA here. So we are a free, obviously, non-legal advocacy service. None of this has changed. We are funded directly by the DHHS, which is the Department of Health and Human Services, which is pretty similar to the Department of Health in England. So our funding is received directly by them. The IMHA service was set up when the Mental Health Act in Victoria was changed in 2014. It took a little bit of a while to get going. So the actual IMHA service didn't start running until August 2015. And so we've just celebrated our 5 years of running as a service. And I started with the service here 2.5 years ago. So I have been with them for a while now. We did do an online event to celebrate the 5 years. And so that is on our website if anybody wanted to go back and look at that, because we did record it. So that is accessible if you want to view that later on. What we do is exactly the same as what IMHA services do in the UK, exactly the same. We provide information on rights, on options, around second opinion, advanced statements. We support through self-advocacy, and obviously we do representational advocacy to treating teams, to the clinicians. And then we can connect as well with other services, such as the Mental Health Complaints Commissioner, or the Second Psychiatric Opinion Service. So what we operate here is exactly the same. The one thing that's interesting as well about the funding, commissioning here is not done at local council level. It is done at that state funding level, which is why we're funded by the equivalent of the DOH rather than through local councils. So there's pros and cons, I think, to both. I can see advantages and disadvantages. And then this is what we look like in Victoria. So we have a team in Melbourne, which consists of a senior advocate and then 5 advocates that work in there as well. We have a team in Bendigo, which is more of the rural areas, so more out of the city. And again, a senior advocate oversees the team, and they have 3 advocates that work there. In Geelong, again, another senior advocate with 3 advocates, and then in Dandenong, a senior with 4 advocates. So those 4 teams cover the whole of Victoria. We obviously have an overall manager and some admin staff. We do have a project officer, and then we do have a consumer consultant and a group that's speaking from experience. In Victoria, they're really keen. The term here, rather than service user or client, is a consumer. So everything I speak about is consumers. And I will talk about the consumer consultant and their role later on, because it's really important and powerful for us. So a little bit about context about how the service came around. There was a previous Mental Health Act in Victoria from 1986, and it is pretty similar to the UK, and obviously that changed in 2014, obviously based on the UN CRPD. The big difference, I think, with the Mental Health Act in Victoria at the moment, there's been a huge shift from substituted decision making to supported decision making. So at the heart of the Mental Health Act here, it's about substituted decision making and ensuring that consumers are enabled through that process at all times and that their views are heard. However, like all areas, not all clinicians necessarily have got to grips with that, and not everybody is doing it as well as they could do, which is where the IMHA service comes in, as we can help assist that, highlight what the principles do say, what rights consumers do have, and work within that space. So there needs to be a really clear focus on recovery, and also making sure that treatment being provided is least restrictive. So is it that somebody could be treated in the community, doesn't need to be in hospital, or could be voluntary rather than having treatment under the Mental Health Act? At all times as well, capacity needs to be respected, and there's obviously the presumption of capacity and having then informed consent. So that's kind of where we came from here, which I feel is similar really to the UK, and how the IMHA services came around there as well. I think what's really interesting, so in Victoria, obviously it's a free service, exactly the same in the UK. Anybody who is receiving compulsory treatment or at risk of being placed on a treatment order is able to access the IMHA service. Sorry, I've slipped into it again, IMHA service. When we say anybody who feels at risk, that is up to that individual to make that assessment. We're not asking clinicians or anybody to decide whether somebody is likely to be having treatment under the Mental Health Act. That person themselves is able to identify and say, I feel that I am at risk, and therefore they're therefore eligible to work with us as a service. We have a lot of priority groups as well, so areas that we are focusing on. And some of those groups include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, as well as those people who might be receiving ECT, and also consumers who are receiving compulsory treatment for the first time. And there's also other areas that we do focus on, maybe those people who are having homelessness and experiencing those things. What I really wanted to look at now was how to access the service in Victoria. How we do that is very different to what was traditionally the services I'd worked in the UK. So within Victoria, we have a phone line number, which is a central point of contact for anybody that contacts us across the state. It's a 1300 number, which means it's a free phone number. We have advocates that provide and answer that phone between 9:30 and 4:30 Monday to Friday. So we share that out amongst ourselves. There's a roster in place, and then we will all answer the phone and be that initial point of contact for consumers when they contact us. During that phone call, we can share information, we can assign to other services, we can do self-advocacy, provide resources, do some self-advocacy coaching. But otherwise, if the consumer identifies that they do want to have an allocated advocate, somebody to work alongside them, then they go through the intake process, and all the key information about their advocacy need is recorded. And then at that point, an allocation email is sent to the senior, to the right team, depending on which area that person is seeking support. So then an allocation email will go to the senior, who will then decide which advocate does that be sent out to, so that they can provide that ongoing one-to-one support going forwards. It's exactly the same. It needs to be mental health specific, issue specific. So nothing else is different really to how we've operated in the UK previously. Information can also come through our website, and there's a contact us form on there, and email. So you can send an email over if that's a preference, rather than doing through the phone line. The other thing is that we have response times. So as a service, we've got busier. And so we now have a response time that if somebody is an inpatient, then we will respond within 3 working days to that contact when they come through the phone line. And if somebody is in the community, then we will respond in 5 working days. And because of the large geographical area really that we are covering, because Victoria is such a large area, a lot of our contact is done by telephone and by email. The service is set up in that way. So there's not as much face-to-face. There is definitely still some, but it's more limited because of the distances involved. Consumers can as well. We have what's known as outposts, so we'll have regular visits to hospitals, and through those visits, that's when consumers can meet with an advocate in person. So traditionally, we will make sure that each hospital is visited at least every 2nd week. So we're not necessarily there every week, but every alternate week, we will be there in person for most of the day if needed, and meeting with people, explaining rights, sharing information, and doing advocacy on the spot as well. And obviously then maintaining those links afterwards if somebody wants further ongoing support from us. I think the impact to us for how we've been during COVID is probably pretty much the same. I know I've attended some of Kate's other webinars, and honestly, the impact that we've had is exactly the same as the impacts that you've had. You know, we haven't been able to go and have face-to-face meetings. We've had to stop going into hospitals, into community clinics. Like you, we've had to work from home, so we've not been able to go into the office. So there's the impact on a team that would normally sit within an office and have interactions, and those casual sort of debriefing opportunities where you can sort of talk to each other if you've had a challenging phone call, if things have been a real frustration for you. So as a team, we've had to grow and adapt and change how we work together, but also with services, we've had to change and do things very differently to how we've done them in the past. Like other services, we're having to run video calls where possible, and telephone calls. Videos are preferable because I think consumers like to see other people, faces, know who it is if they've not had interactions with us before. So we are having those as much as possible. Again, some services will say they haven't got the ICT equipment available for that, or they've only got one license for Zoom, so they can't have competing video calls at one time. So it is a constant challenge of how we work with that. And it's just building links with each service and managing that as best we can. We hold rights groups. So we'll go on video. We'd normally traditionally be in a room in the inpatient setting, and we would talk about rights. What rights do you have under the Mental Health Act? What rights do you have? How can you have those interactions with your clinicians and talk about those rights? And so what we're doing now is doing those rights groups, but we're running them by a video so that we can still try and have a small group of consumers at one time to talk things through, but we're there. So one of my advocates was talking to me and saying that the allied health team that were facilitating this said it was almost like a Big Brother diary room, because the tablet was set up on the table and then consumers would go in one at a time and sit down and have a conversation with the advocate and tell them about what's been going on. And then they would leave the room and then somebody else would go in and have the same conversation. So there can be restrictions as well on how many people can be in a room at one time. So we really are being creative. How do we do this? How do we manage it? How do we reach people? And I know this is happening across the world with those conversations, you know, with vulnerable people. How do we make sure that everybody knows that they're entitled to an IMHA advocate and what their rights are within that space? This is just a few statistics about the first 3 years of service for the IMHA service in Victoria. I just think it's quite interesting. So when it talks about outposts, those are those regular visits to hospitals. How many regular places are we visiting? And that has gone up year on year and is pretty much stable now. So as a service, we go out to all the mental health units across the state. So we have regular visits there. The information sessions, those are information sessions that we provided to clinicians to let other people know about our service. And obviously that's dropped off a little bit as we've become better known. But my reflection is, it really is that still after 5 years, and I know this was the same in the UK after IMHA started, we are constantly having to educate. We always need to educate and let people know about the service. There are still so many clinicians, social workers, nurses, consultants, registrars that haven't heard of IMHA, don't know how to work with us. And so we're constantly still having to do that and raise our profile and raise our awareness. The participants is the number of people that attended those information sessions. So the number of clinicians that came out and heard about the IMHA service. And then we've broken down into 2 areas, those high intensity services So advocacy where we've provided advocacy, or where we may have done some coaching for self-advocacy. And that has increased year on year and has increased again in year 4 and year 5 as well. We haven't officially got that data together, but it has increased a lot. And the low intensity is around those information and referrals. Maybe somebody just wanted a referral to legal support, so we can make a referral in that area. Maybe it was a carer and we're not able to provide advocacy for carers, but there are specific services. So we've shared that information or made referrals on. And what is quite constant and quite typical each year is, on average, 3/4 of our referrals come from consumers themselves. They're self-referrals rather than referrals from other services or from clinicians. This is just looking a little bit about the age of consumers that we work with. I don't think there's anything particularly surprising in that area. That does seem to be a standard across the board. Consumers that were born overseas, there's a huge number of consumers that are born overseas, so we are always having to think about interpreters and how we can provide resources in appropriate languages. A divide between male and female is pretty average. I think one of the reflections I have here is that we ask consumers if they identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. It's really key to us. The statistics here show what the state average is for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. However, my reflection and comparison is that those consumers that are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander are really overrepresented within prisons and also within the mental health system. And therefore, my thought was that it's the same really in terms of the Black and ethnic minority groups in the UK who are severely overrepresented within the prisons as well. And it's just an interesting comparison there. And when we look at, sorry, I'm just looking at what the chat says. When we look
note
at
of all the questions, Emma, so we'll do them
okay
if you prefer.
Thank you. I was trying to look at both and I realize I can't do it all. When we look at where the services are delivered, I don't think it's surprising that most of those are in Melbourne, sort of 75% are in Melbourne, and then otherwise it's the more rural areas. And when I say more rural areas, you know, when we look at travel and the time it takes, so the team in Bendigo will support Mildura, that's a 5-hour drive away. So when an advocate goes out there, they travel one day, they stay overnight, they're then able to see and visit the hospital, the community teams, the inpatient services, then they stay another night before they're traveling back. So one thing that's actually a positive from COVID is that those services have had to engage with us with videos, have had to engage more with us. So whereas we would only be able to go out usually every 4 weeks to those services, we can now increase that and we can have more interactions with those services, more presence for the consumers. And that's just been really important and really invaluable. And I think there are some things that we would like to take away from COVID and use that going forward with that, so that we don't have the travel time all the time. There is still most definitely an importance of being there in person, but I think it's a balance of doing it in person and also sometimes not having the travel and being able to do some more remote working. So I think it's really important to consider that and how that has made a difference for us. And then the main issues, and I reflected on these when I first joined the IMHA service in Victoria, and I still reflect on them. I think the issues that we see here are exactly the same issues that I have worked with in the UK and supported advocates with who are going through their qualification. It's about being involved in decisions, being truly involved in decisions, really heard. It's around medication changes, moving from maybe a depot to oral medication, and being involved with discharge planning, understanding what the plan is, how things will happen, the timeframes for that, fully being involved in that, and also just having an understanding of mental health systems, how everybody sits together, how everybody works. Some of the acronyms are definitely very different here compared to the UK, but the same feeling and the same understanding is there. I walked into an inpatient unit here and it's just like I'm walking into an inpatient unit in the UK. They're physically laid out the same way. There is the same vibe of the nurses station overlooking the unit. You know, you've got the nurses, everybody's the same. And so a lot of the consumers here really have struggled to understand who's who, how it all slots together, who's involved in different angles of their care, who's going to be supporting them going forwards. So a lot of the time it's about having that clarity and that understanding, as well as obviously having discussions around discharge and medication. Those are really key areas. So one thing that happened for the IMHA service between 2015 to 2018 was we had an evaluation at 2018 after 3 years of service. And it was an independent evaluation through one of the universities here. And the idea was to have a look at what is working well, what are we doing that's right, what could be done differently, and are there things that could really be done better? Are there things that could make a huge difference going forwards? So through the evaluation, which was co-produced with, there was a legal member, clinicians, obviously consumers, and research professionals as well. There was involvement from 69 consumers that had used the IMHA service. And 40 who hadn't used the IMHA service, so that there was a comparison of the system and what both sides had taken from that and what both people had found. There was input from 292 clinicians and 9 oversight safeguarding bodies, and then sort of consumer and carer peak bodies, as well as input from 31 mental health lawyers and 16 IMHA advocates. And what the findings from our evaluation showed, that actually we were a fantastic service at making sure that challenges were happening, that we were on the side of the consumer, we were championing their rights, and we were right there beside them, and that consumers felt really highly regarded and valued, and that they were really listened to. And what was really interesting as well was that sometimes consumers identified that even if the outcome that they had was different to what they maybe had initially wanted and their initial thoughts, that actually just having an advocate with them, somebody to help them express their views, their wishes, to be on their side, actually made all the difference, and being heard is all they actually wanted. And some of the key messages that came from our evaluation showed that actually, in an ideal world, that IMHA needed to be an opt-out system. So at the moment, we raise awareness, we let consumers know that we're there, we have publicity materials, we do education sessions, we're hopeful that services will be telling consumers about us. But actually, what would be better would be an opt-out service, so everybody was automatically allocated an advocate, and after contact with an advocate could then determine what level of support they may or may not want, or whether they actually did want to have an advocate. And I think that's really key, because that's a different system, I think, from anywhere fully opt-out, so that there would be an automatic discussion with advocates to determine how much input and involvement they would like from a service. Obviously, in order for that to happen, we need to be adequately resourced, because as a service, we can't do that on the budgets that we've got at the moment, on the number of staff that we've got at the moment. That's not going to happen. So there would have to be an increase in resources to help facilitate that. And that also we need to continue to improve the awareness across the sector and that understanding of advocacy. So we have to carry on building in those education sessions and making sure that we are really heard. And one of the things that we have done, supported decision making, as I said, is kind of at the heart of the Mental Health Act here in Victoria. So we have put together some supported decision making training. We have a 1-hour session and a 2-hour session. And pre-COVID, we would go out to services and we would deliver that training so that those decision makers really understood what was happening and what was needed. Obviously, with COVID, we can't go out in person and do that. So as a service, we have created a 1-hour webinar. So, well, actually, first of all, there's a 1-hour e-learning. So any clinicians can jump online and do the e-learning in their own time when they're ready. And that gives them some knowledge around supported decision making. But the bigger picture is that then there's a commitment to join us for a 1-hour webinar where we can actually look at some case studies, some examples, and really talk that through. So embedding that knowledge so that it can be used in practice going forwards. We're just rolling a pilot out until the end of this year for that. And then from January, it'll be accessible for all services and for all clinicians. And I guess that's something that we have also learned from COVID, is that jumping online to webinars is a little bit easier when you haven't got the travel time. So we're hopeful that those hour sessions can be well attended from all parts of Victoria, because, you know, people from different areas of the state can all come together for 1 hour and not have to do the travel and the journey time related to that. So we'll see if that sort of pans out as we're hoping. I did mention before about our consumer consultant. So as I said, we started delivering services in August 2015. So we have just celebrated 5 years as a service. During the establishment of the service, IMHA employed a consumer consultant, so somebody with their own lived experience, was involved from the initial setup of the service to shape what we do, how we do it, and to be really, really a part of the team. So this consumer consultant is employed for 3 days a week and has been with us since the service began and continues to be with us. It's a role that's embedded in the senior management team within the IMHA service and is a really valuable person. Wanda is our consumer consultant. She's absolutely fantastic. The knowledge and understanding that she can bring to us and shape our service is phenomenal. One of the things that Wanda does is she runs a Speaking from Experience group, who are a group of 10 consumers who have their own lived experience. They meet on a monthly basis, and most of the group now have had some support from IMHA over the past 5 years. The group has changed a lot, but the current consumers that are involved in that space have had some involvement from IMHA. And that group and Wanda's role are involved in all areas, and I mean all areas of our service, from recruitment, so on recruitment panels, involved in all our policies, our procedures, the shaping of the service. Every area they're part of and are really valued and extremely valuable members that we want. And I have to say that lived experience workforce is something that is really key here, not tokenistic. It is very much a respectful and meaningful role for people to be involved with. A lot of our self-advocacy resources, we had a project officer involved for 12 months to create self-advocacy resources, but they were co-produced with consumers and also through the Speaking from Experience group. So we have a huge number of resources that have been co-produced that consumers have said, this is what would be really helpful for me when I went through this, when I had that first admission, this is what I needed to know. I wanted to understand in terms of complaints, what I could do, how I could do it. And so, you know, we have all of those resources and they are very meaningful and very powerful, I feel. I will share where you can access those later on. We created, through that self-advocacy project, we've created some videos. So they're really fantastic, sort of bite-sized 3-minute videos about different rights. We've created some printed resources. So there's information that we can share. You know, if you want to make a complaint, this is what you can do. If you'd like to have more say in your treatment, this is what you can do. If you'd like to discuss your medication, these are the options available to you. The other thing that we have created that seems to be more beneficial for the younger consumers that we work with is we have a web app. So consumers can go onto the web app, they can identify the issues that they have, the options available, and then it will create a self-advocacy plan for the consumer, which can be emailed to themselves, or they can jump back onto the same spot later on to kind of revisit what's there and what they have done, and then tweak that plan if they've done some self-advocacy, but the outcomes haven't been exactly what they thought they would be. Another thing I really wanted to touch on was in Victoria, we currently at the moment are going through a royal commission into Victoria's mental health system. Really, a royal commission is very similar to an inquiry that takes place, but the royal commission here is a statewide one because it's relevant to Victoria. The royal commission was established because there was widespread acknowledgement that mental health services in Victoria had reached crisis point. Many people were living with mental illness and they weren't receiving the treatment, the care and the support that they needed. And it wasn't particularly effective. It wasn't working well. So the Royal Commission, excuse me, I'm just going to have a glass of water, started in February 2019, and there was an expectation that it would have finished in October 2020. But unfortunately, due to COVID, it's rolling on until February next year. We have had an interim report that came out in November last year. And in order to complete the Royal Commission, there's been a huge amount of involvement. There's been witness statements that are produced, there's been public hearings, submissions from different bodies, from peak bodies, from carer organisations, and obviously IMHA has also been involved with that, and we've made a submission as well. The Royal Commission team have also had meetings with different groups, with different bodies, including IMHA and including the Speaking from Experience group that I mentioned earlier. So there's been a huge amount so far. And some of the key things that have come out, there's been 9 recommendations so far that have come out from that, and that's from the interim report. And some of those have said that the key things going forward is there needs to be far more support for a lived experience workforce. There needs to be a designated a lived experience led service. So there needs to be a designated service that will be set up, and it will be led by lived experience workforce. There needs to be increasing investment in suicide prevention, and unfortunately they do need to also expand some of the acute services that they're able to, but in targeted areas, in areas they know they don't have enough beds. We were really fortunate in a way. When the Royal Commission started, the involvement, the number of people that contacted IMHA rose tremendously. There was a lot more talk about mental health, a lot more awareness in the media. So our intake line became really busy. It's always busy, but it became really busy. So we were able to argue and demonstrate how much that had increased. So we've been very fortunate that we've been given 12-month limited funding, but to support us by giving us additional funding for intake advocates. So at the moment, we have a small intake team who are able to answer our phone line, able to do the self-advocacy, able to take on allocations, which means that advocates who were previously having to sort of spend half a day a week doing that have now got more time to do direct advocacy. So it's worked out really fantastic. And what we're hopeful for is the submission that we have made would be supporting the opt-out model that was highlighted by our evaluation. So we're really hopeful that maybe in February next year, we do have that opt-out model, and that the Royal Commission find that that's something really valuable, because the Victorian State Government have said that any of the findings that the Royal Commission do, they will fund. So whatever is seen as necessary, the government will fund that and make sure it's in place so that the mental health system is completely changed and overhauled, really, and made more effective and better. And then I'm just going to finish off here. This is our self-advocacy resources. These are all accessible on our website, and some can be downloaded. We have a self-advocacy workshop where we can go to consumers and talk about what self-advocacy is and share that knowledge. As I mentioned, we've got the self-advocacy tool, we've got videos, we've got written fact sheets. We have a 1-800 number, which is just a pre-recorded of your rights under the Mental Health Act. So it's just on loop. So you can phone that up anytime and listen to your rights. And then specific legislation in Victoria around advance statements and nominated persons. And we have some videos and written information around those as well. And then my last one is any questions. So our website is there, my email address is there, and I'm very happy for Kate to send round my presentation. I've got no problems with that going around to everybody, so that you can reach out to me and touch base with me at any times. I'm very happy to do that.
Thank you. Do a virtual round of applause. Amazing, Emma. Thank you so much. There's been loads of chat, particularly on your last points around the consumer champion. And lots of people connecting with that. And actually, lots of services in the UK, you know, employing people with lived experience and peer advocates. That's marvellous. So we've got 14 minutes. Somebody's just said that was very interesting. Good night. So there's been some brilliant questions. I'm going to group them into themes. So the first one was around the funding. So going back to the early slides. Yes. What are your kind of take and thoughts around the advantages and disadvantages of being centrally funded?
I think it's interesting. I think in terms of that funding, so in Victoria and Australia widely, there is not as, my husband was telling me this, the responsibility and the regulations about commissioning is very different. So we almost shape what we want we're told this is the money, off you go and deliver the service. So it's not as strict on this is what you've got to do, this is how you do it. We have a little bit more scope about how we can deliver that. You know, when I spoke about our response times, when the service was set up, initially if you were inpatient, it was 2 days, and it was 3 days if you were community. That's now changed to 3 and 5. And that came from advocates saying, we can't meet those timeframes anymore. So we just went to the commissioners and said, we're changing this. And I think that would be very different in the UK. You wouldn't be able to go and sort of just say, we want, you know, we are doing this. It would be a discussion point and asking that. So I think there are definite differences there. I think in some ways it's easier because we can go straight to the department and ask and highlight all the time why we need extra funding or why there is a delay with some things and why we can't meet certain timeframes. So I think in some respects it's
it makes me
actually easier.
It makes me think back to when, so going back 7, 8 years or 10 years maybe, when independent complaints advocacy in the UK was centrally funded, wasn't it? So ICAS, when it was then called, used to be funded centrally by the Department of Health through 3 main providers, and they often reported better access to government, much more joined up, much more easier to and flexible. So yeah, it's interesting. What do you think of the downsides?
I think in some ways we can be seen. Sometimes we can be seen as not fully independent. I think less independent. There is that concern, really, are you independent of the government because you're receiving it directly from them rather than a different chain through? So I think that's questioned a lot by consumers. That's something that we are asked a lot of. Are you really independent?
That's interesting. And I think that we're questioned a lot about our independence, but we don't realise it. So in the UK, so like whenever I speak to family groups, and lots of people with lived experience who've been detained, and I'll ask them, you know, did you have an advocate? And lots of people say no, and lots of people say that, you know, that they're not independent. And particular issues, I don't know if anyone's on the call today, in private settings. So where the private hospital might commission advocacy themselves, and lots of concern from patients and families that the advocates aren't independent. But it's not something we really talk about in the UK, which is interesting. Great. Next kind of bucket of questions came into the accessibility theme, and you kind of talked about this at length, but lots of kind of questions about how people find out about the service. If somebody lacks capacity to ask for an advocate, you know, do they get one, or is that part of the drivers for opt-out? Do you have a big presence on the wards? Do people self-refer? Anything?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the opt-out, that would be where those consumers that can't ask to meet with us, because they wouldn't automatically be signed to us. So the slight difference is, although the Mental Health Act talks about IMHA, we're not kind of embedded quite as well as the UK. So there is no onus put on the service to make sure that consumers know about us. So it's very much if the service does do it, if they're of a good practice, and then there's always those services that don't. So understanding and finding out about us can be a bit hit and miss. We can all put posters up, but they can always get ripped down. We're not there at the moment, so we don't actually know, is our information still accessible, still available? We can ask, but we don't see it in the same way as when we were going out in person, which I imagine is the same for everybody at this time with COVID. So we are dependent on those good services that make sure consumers know about us in those mutual help meetings in the morning, making sure that IMHA is, IMHA, I'm changing over again, making sure that we're mentioned. And that's really key. But I do think where that opt-out is where it could make that difference, to make sure everybody not just knows about the service, but actually has contact with the service. I think it's great that they know it exists, but until an advocate talks through what the service can do, what we can't do, what our scope is, you're never going to really be able to make an informed decision, do I want to work with you or not?
Oh gosh, yeah. You know, we've all seen the professionals say, "Oh, an advocate's when you want to make a complaint," or
Yes. Oh, that so annoys me.
There's something just very obvious, isn't there, about at the point when people are given this information, they're often at their unwellest. You know, they're often in crisis, and the idea of, oh, and by the way, there's an advocacy service. People don't always hear that and take it on board, but the hospital have actually told them, so they can tick.
They can tick that box to say it's done.
Yeah, and they have, where it's not been done in a meaningful way. Yeah, so great distinction there. Yeah. Just to mention for our UK listeners that the Mental Health Act review, which we're expecting the white paper to come out next month, is considering opt-outs, and it's also considering extending advocacy to informal patients. So we're kind of waiting to see what the recommendations from the Wesley review will go forward, but we're hoping that opt-out, because it's so critical, and you know, with the peer advocacy and the cultural appropriate advocacy, you know, there's a lot of thought around how do we actually get people who need advocacy the most get an advocate. So I do encourage people to keep an eye on that white paper and to respond, you know, when we know what they're going to be proposing.
We're very
sorry,
I was just going to touch on the informal sort of advocacy for those informal consumers, because I think that's something that's always been missing potentially, and not something that's been there in the UK. So we're very fortunate here in Victoria. There is another advocacy service that is specifically there for people who are voluntary, who are informal. So we can signpost to them and they can signpost to us. So there's a clear distinction, but they still get an advocacy service.
That's interesting. So when people are on the wards, they still get an advocate. Yeah. And does that kind of jar at times? Because I know sometimes in the wards in UK hospitals, it can be a bit frustrating, you know, like, oh, what, I've got to speak to somebody else, can't you just sort it out? Do you have that, or is it fairly clearly defined?
It's fairly clearly defined. I think there are some people that would prefer that whoever they spoke to at the time could deal with things, but we have that slight scope that if somebody feels at risk of being placed under the Mental Health Act, that's enough of that they can be eligible for us. So it's not that they are having the treatment under, but they identify themselves at feeling at risk, that if they aren't going to take their medication or they don't agree to this treatment, that I'm going to be put on a treatment order, I'm going to have a section put on me. Got you.
Quick one around children. So is the IMHA service for children, young people, or is it 18 and above?
No, it is children and young people as well. So in Melbourne specifically, we have a youth inpatient service, which is for it is sort of 18 to 24. We also have a children and adolescent mental health service, which is for the under 18s. And we also, within the children's hospital, we have a specific children's hospital for all health conditions. And within there is a mental health unit as well. And sometimes there can be 12, 13-year-olds, unfortunately, who are having treatment under the Mental Health Act, but they're still very much accessible. And we are still able to provide that service, and will go out in person as well.
Great. Got you. A question for Christine, excuse me, around cultural needs, and are there any specific cultural mental health services for Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders, or are there any kind of issues that you see coming from that group? How do you respond to those things?
There are definitely services. So within each mental health hospital, within each mental health service, there is an Aboriginal health liaison officer. So if we are talking to consumers and they identify that they are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders and they want to have links, then we can sign to those links. There are also lots of services that are very Aboriginal controlled services. So there is the Aboriginal Health Service. So we can sign over to those as well. I think specifics are, I think it comes down to the same really as what I was seeing in the UK with the young black males, that there is that group that are more likely to be receiving treatment under a mental health order or in the prison system, and therefore it's working and raising awareness really as well, and highlighting those concerns. But yeah, so it definitely is something that we have to be mindful of. We always ask, what does that person want? What does that consumer want, in the sense of what links would they like? Do they want to speak to a specific Aboriginal controlled service, or are they happy working with us as a service?
Got you. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. And just for everyone on the session at the minute, well, sorry, Emma, there's calls to bring you back to the UK.
I don't think I can with COVID at the moment. I'm not allowed to leave.
No, you're proper on lockdown, aren't you?
I'm on proper lockdown.
Yeah, just for people on the call, we've got a brilliant session at, I think, at 2 o'clock today with Anthony, who's going to be looking at cultural advocacy and how advocates can mitigate against racial bias. So for anyone interested, well, I think everyone should be interested in this, because it is a big issue. Yeah, not if, it should be all of us. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so there's a couple of more questions, if that's okay.
Of course it is.
So 2 quick ones, which might be yes, no answers. Do you have the same appeal process like tribunal and hospital managers?
Oh, see, I struggle with that. So we do have a mental health tribunal, 100%. So there is the route for appeal to say, I don't feel I should be on this treatment order. Can I be discharged? And the same panel members, exactly the same, 3 panel members, the same setup, who would determine, yes, you should still remain on your treatment order, or you can be taken off that. The other thing that the tribunal do, which I struggle with, is they also determine the length of the order. So the consultant, the decision maker isn't the person. The decision maker will say, you need to be placed under the Mental Health Act, but the tribunal will convene to determine whether that should be for 6 weeks, for 16 weeks, for 52 weeks. So they kind of have a double edge. They actually determine how long somebody receives that order for, but also you can appeal to them as well. So I don't sit comfortably with that one as much, from what my experience was in the UK.
Well, yeah, I mean, gosh, 52 weeks is a tremendous amount of time, isn't it? I mean, the maximum here is 6 months, isn't it, to be renewed?
Yeah.
Gosh, that really is. Do nearest relatives have any rights? Is there kind of a role akin to the nearest relative or a person supporting?
Yes, so there's the nominated person, and that pretty much is, it's what the person chooses is the person that they want to be able to represent their views if they're having treatment. Yeah, so similar role.
And similar to what the Mental Health Act review is looking at, getting rid of nearest relative and nominate, the person can nominate whoever they like. Okay, and practical one, when you're wearing PPE on the wards, or are you not going on the ward?
Yeah,
you are.
I have been on the ward last week. I went last week. So to go onto the ward, at the moment, because of the restrictions that are in Melbourne, which are really tight, so I have to have a work permit from my organisation to be able to go anywhere. And all I had to do, they do the temperature checks, and then it's just wearing a mask. That's the only thing I have to do. I don't have to wear full PPE.
Got you. And the question was around, how do you identify as different from the ward staff? So is that kind of with your name badge?
Yeah, we wear lanyards. So the IMHA is very orange. So the PowerPoint was orange, but that's all our resources are orange. I have orange lanyards and carry lots of orange information. And so that identifies us. Yeah, very much so.
Thank you. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I'm conscious of time, and that's our hour up. So I'm just going to say thank you so much. It's been brilliant for me personally to see you again, but also to hear. I think everyone's loads of thanks being expressed on the chat box. So brilliant, Emma. Really great to hear about these issues. If people, I'm going to just put your Twitter handle on the. It's IMHA Vic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So that's Emma's organisation's Twitter handle. Please get on, because I think the more we can kind of talk about advocacy during Advocacy Awareness Week and the Advocacy Conference Week, that we can highlight awareness and attract more people to be thinking about the importance of advocacy. So please do.
Totally.
I should put mine as well, so I can retweet everything that you're doing. And yeah, the next session for people who haven't perhaps booked on but might be interested is at 12:30. It's going to be from Alexis Quinn, who's an autistic person who has got lived experience of being detained. And her story is dramatic and shocking and moving and inspirational. And I think every advocate should really listen to Alexis, because she's an excellent speaker and really interesting and important views on detention and advocacy. So I'd encourage you to join us for that one. So yeah, thanks Emma, really
Thank
wonderful.
you.
And
good luck with the rest of your day.
Thank you. Yeah, good night.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.